I'm sure, as everyone knows, we're going to be discussing tonight West Windsor's involvement in the American Revolution. One thing I want to emphasize is that West Windsor is obviously next to several historic towns, but this lecture does primarily focus on West Windsor's involvement in the Revolution. Again, I'll mention a bit about surrounding towns, but most of the focus will be on ours. And this lecture should take about 25-ish minutes, after which I'll happily answer any questions. So we need to journey back. First, we need to journey back to a time when to the mid 1700s. In those days, West Windsor as a township did not exist, and neither did many of the surrounding towns. That includes Princeton, East Windsor, and a bunch of others. Instead, we were all part of a larger entity called Windsor Township, which informally organized in 1731, formally incorporated in 1751, and encompassed the land that you can see in the blue borders here. It included all of present-day West Windsor, Robbinsville, and East Windsor, as well as portions of Hightstown, Millstone, and Monroe townships, and all of Princeton southeast of Nassau Street and Stockton Street. So at the time, nearly all of Windsor Township was woods or farmland, which stretched as far as the eye could see. Windsor Township itself existed until 1797, when it dissolved into East Windsor and West Windsor. Even then, West Windsor retained all land in Princeton, southeast of Nassau Street until the mid-1800s, which is a point that I'll talk about later. And this land included the Princeton Battlefield, Nassau Hall, and more, which is why it's relevant to this lecture. So on the next page, we're going to see a list of all of the revolutionaries that the Historical Society suspects are relevant to tonight's lecture. And by revolutionaries, I don't just mean soldiers, although most of the men here were soldiers that either lived within present-day West Windsor or owned land within present-day West Windsor. However, there were a few others. For example, one that we're going to be talking about shortly wasn't a soldier, but instead a Declaration of Independence signer that owned substantial land holdings in present-day West Windsor. Another was a reputed loyalist who lived locally but had to flee due to his suspected British sympathies. But in particular, I want to highlight that the ones that you can see in yellow are the ones that we're going to be talking specifically about tonight. So first is actually one of the ones that are more interesting to me, which is a man named Richard Stockton, who a lot of you might know. So Richard Stockton was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was born in 1730 at his family's estate, which is called Morven. It's off of Stockton Street in Princeton. And it's a famous museum to this day and a local landmark. And I recommend everyone visit it. It's a great place to visit. He was elected to the Second Continental Congress in 1776 and embarked on a 2-month journey to Ticonderoga in New York to assist the Continental Army. Upon his return, he traveled to the home of a friend named John Covenhoven in Monmouth County to evacuate his family to safety. However, while he was there in late 1776, he and Covenhoven were captured in the middle of the night, stripped of their property, and turned over to the British in Perth Amboy. And they held him prisoner there for weeks, unfortunately torturing him and forcing him to sign a loyalty pledge, and didn't release him until January 1777. It took him nearly 2 years to regain his health, but he carried mental scars for the rest of his life and died in 1781, 2 years too early to see the war's end. So the reason I mentioned Stockton is, again, because in 1765, the same year the British passed the Stamp Act, which incited fury in the revolutionaries, Stockton purchased 300 acres in West Windsor, which overlapped the Mercer Oaks Golf Course and Mercer Lake that exist today. At the time, it was farmland and woodland. We don't know how long he kept this land, and he certainly didn't live here because his estate was in the village of Princeton, again, Morven. But this nevertheless ties West Windsor to this Declaration of Independence signer. One thing I'd personally love to see here is in the future some kind of sign at the golf course recognizing Stockton's ownership of a lot of the land. So, but now we can move on to actual skirmishes and battles. So late 1776 and early 1777, which was coincidentally the period of Stockton's imprisonment, also saw much revolutionary action in central New Jersey. This included the Battle of Trenton on December 26, the Battle of Assunpink Creek on January 2nd, and the Battle of Princeton on January 3rd. The time period spanning these three battles is commonly referred to as the 10 Crucial Days because of how critical these battles were to saving the Revolution. In the months leading up to the 10 Crucial Days, George Washington's army had suffered defeat after defeat after defeat for months. His soldiers' morale was at an all-time low, and many intended to abandon the army when their contracts were going to expire on January 1st, 1777. However, the 10 Crucial Days snatched victory from the jaws of imminent defeat three times in a row, which convinced many Americans to convinced many of the soldiers to renew their contracts, persuaded a lot of new recruits to enlist in the spring, and positioned the Americans to drive the British out of New Jersey eventually, and also showed the world, including eventual French supporters, that the revolution was not a lost cause. So all of this took place in central New Jersey, especially Trenton, especially Princeton, but West Windsor did have an involvement too, as we're going to explore in the next slide. Again, the first skirmish of the 10 Crucial Days was the Battle of Trenton on December 26, 1776. Well, as I'm sure most of you know, Washington famously crossed the Delaware and surprised the Hessian garrison at Trenton, routing the enemy and taking many prisoners. So next slide. However, even after this victory, and while he was still encamped in Trenton after the Battle of Trenton, Washington needed to keep this momentum and was already at significant risk because he knew very little about the enemy's size and troop movements in the broader area. So on December 30th, 1776, so 4 days after the Battle of Trenton, a small scouting party led by Colonel Joseph Reed left Trenton to scope out the approach to Princeton on the behalf of George Washington. They met many farmers who were too afraid to talk to them and tell them, where the British were, out of fear for a British reprisal. However, on their return journey, they spotted a small British foraging party raiding a farm, roughly 1,000 feet northeast of the intersection of Clarksville and Quaker Bridge roads. Colonel Joseph Reed gave the order to charge, and soon a dozen enemy cavalry were captured within present-day West Windsor's borders. Now, these troops were marched back to Trenton and interrogated, and upon interrogation, they actually revealed the enemy's troop size and position in Princeton. And they also revealed that British General Charles Cornwallis intended to march from Princeton with thousands of reinforcements to recapture Trenton. And when he would do so, he was thus going to leave Princeton poorly reinforced. This intel helped Washington greatly at the Battle of Assunpink Creek and the Battle of Princeton, as we're going to explore in the ensuing slides. However, first, I just want to reiterate again, this capture took place at a farm off of Clarksville and Quaker Bridge roads. Over generations, that same farm would pass through the Flock, Adams, and Coleman families. Unfortunately, the farm was entirely bulldozed in the 1950s or 1960s when it and a bunch of neighboring properties were turned into an agricultural research and development facility by an international chemical conglomerate called American Cyanamid. This company operated there from the 1950s until the early 2000s, and its facility was recently demolished. And the property has long been, I'm sure a lot of people know about this, the property has long been the site of various contentious proposals for development. In the mid 2000s, I know there was a proposal for a mall of sorts that didn't go anywhere. More recently, there had been a proposal for thousands of houses, and now it's a very hotly debated site of a proposed warehouse complex. However, that's talking a little bit too modern, and the point of tonight's lecture is the revolution, so we're going to talk about that instead. So now that Washington was in possession of intel about enemy troop movements from those captured British troops, Washington was able to prepare for General Charles Cornwallis's assault at the Battle of Assunpink Creek on January 2nd, 1777. The Americans managed to hold off their enemy until the evening, when both armies retreated to regroup. Believing that he had Washington trapped and outnumbered, Cornwallis decided to wait until the morning to renew the attack. However, what he didn't know, that with knowledge that Princeton was now poorly fortified, Washington's Council of War had other plans. That night, so the night of January 2nd, the majority, and January 2nd, January 3rd, The majority of Washington's army left the city and quietly marched towards Princeton, while a small contingent stayed in Trenton and lit fires and made noise to fool Cornwallis into believing that the Americans were still encamped there. So the majority of the army again departed the city, and their secretive route included Quaker Bridge Road, which is West Windsor's western border with Lawrence Township. And you can see that in the map here. This army was led by three militiamen, and one of them was named Ezekiel Anderson, whose family owned hundreds of acres in present-day West Windsor, which is the largest land tract that's highlighted in the map. You can also see Richard Stockton's land and the land that was eventually owned by John Flock, where the British troops were captured. On their way, again, they passed by both of these tracks. And I mentioned Jonathan Flock. To be clear, he was also a soldier in Washington's army, and he bought the very property where those British troops were captured in 1799, and his family would own it for the next 90 years. So on that morning of January 3rd, the soldiers trudged for, I think it was about 12 or 13 miles through cold and wind and in the dead of night. However, the sun soon rose, both metaphorically and literally, when the Americans triumphed over the British at the Battle of Princeton on January 3rd, 1777. So in 1914, a hereditary society called the Sons of the Revolution installed 12 granite obelisks between Trenton and Princeton, marking the route of that revolutionary march that passed through West Windsor. One of the obelisks does stand partly in West Windsor in the Quaker Bridge Road median near Nassau Park Pavilion. It's between the entrance to Nassau Park Pavilion off of Quaker Bridge Road and the Delaware and Raritan Canal. 110 years after their installation, these obelisks remain memorials to this transformative juncture in American history. So now we can talk a little bit about the Battle of Princeton. On the morning of January 3rd, 1777, so several hours after Washington and his army began their march from Princeton, Washington and his army effectively stumbled upon British troops near the farm of Thomas Clark, where they engaged in battle. The Americans eventually drove the British back to Nassau Hall in downtown Princeton, where the enemy was ended up holed inside the building. However, they eventually surrendered after intense cannon bombardment, and I believe it was partly led by Alexander Hamilton. I might not be correct about that. And then, although I'm not exactly sure how true the next sentence I'm about to say is, I've heard that a cannonball also blasted through a window of Nassau Hall and decapitated the painting of King George III. And again, I don't know if that's apocryphal, but it's one of my favorite stories, even if it's not true. So the Battle of Princeton was the third and last of the 10 crucial days that helped stave off potential American defeat, including, again, the Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Assunpink Creek. And all three battles and the 10 crucial days in general positioned the Patriots for greater victories down the road. However, not everything was happy. Of course, these were battles. And one of George Washington's compatriots in the war was killed. This man was a Scottish immigrant named Hugh Mercer, a brigadier general in Washington's army. Mercer had fought in the New Jersey and New York campaigns and was mortally wounded at the Battle of Princeton. Legend says that even with a bayonet still impaled in him, he refused to leave his men and instead laid under a white oak tree, which you can see in the bottom left, rallying the soldiers around him. This tree became known as the Mercer Oak, which I'm sure many of you recognize, and stood for generations at the Princeton battlefield until it finally fell, I think about 25-something years ago. However, an acorn was planted in its place, and this acorn, I believe, was from the tree, and a new tree, essentially descendant, stands in its place. Now, Mercer County itself was named after Hugh Mercer, and the seal prominently features the Mercer Oak. More relevant to, not relevant, but more specific to West Windsor, however, there is a community named Port Mercer. It was a mid-1800s community that developed after the Delaware and Raritan Canal was built in the 1830s. And that itself, too, Port Mercer, is named after Hugh Mercer. So one common theme of war outside of the battles is not just the damages to the soldiers themselves, but also harms to civilians. In West Windsor, various damages were perpetrated by the British and Hessians against the farming families, and we have various documentation related to that. Petitions to the colonial government, for example, have cited stolen livestock, clothing, farm equipment, housewares, and food. Just across the river in present-day Plainsboro, there was an individual named William Scudder who presented a claim, I believe it was for about 11,000 pounds in the 1780s, 1770s, cited the burning of his mill and barns. And horrifyingly, there were also some assaults on civilians. I'm not going to really go into detail, and I don't know how uh, much I should detail about this, but for example, there were two British horsemen that are said to have sexually assaulted the daughter of a Penstack farmer who had been providing lodging for them, for instance. So in the next slide, you can see a farm that I know at least that some of you recognize very well. This is the historic Reed Slayback Homestead, which is one of West Windsor's very oldest houses, and it was probably built in the 1750s or 1760s. It stands at 540 to 542 Village Road West in the historic Dutch Neck community in the center of West Windsor, around the intersection of South Mill Road and Village Roads East and West. This farm is not exactly there, but it's just a few minutes down the road. And I'm pointing this out because during the Revolution, this farm was owned by a man named David Slayback. In 1782, he submitted a petition for compensation because in 6 years prior, December 1776, a group of Hessian marauders had stolen two of his young cows here. This is probably the only building that I know of that still stands in town that was associated with any of the enemy's damage claims upon civilians. So now we're going to discuss and explore a little bit about one of in my opinion, one of the most interesting figures in West Windsor history. We're going to talk about a man named Jacob G. Bergen, who was a Revolutionary War veteran as well. In 1777, Jacob was a lieutenant in the Somerset County Militia. The next decade, he ran several inns in Princeton. He must have been very popular because locals planned but did not technically succeed to have the village of Princeton split from Windsor Township in Somerset County and hold its first government meetings in Bergen's Tavern. And one thing I want to reiterate is at the time, Princeton was not its own independent town, just like how West Windsor was not its own independent town. Instead, much of it was part of Windsor Township, and Princeton instead was a kind of an informal village, just like how Dutch Neck, even nowadays, is an informal village, like Edinburgh, like Rover's Mill, etc. So Jacob also owned a few taverns in Trenton and Philadelphia. One of them in Trenton was called the French Arms Tavern. In October of 1784, Jacob signed a lease with the United States Continental Congress for them to use the French Arms as their meeting place. This made Jacob Bergen's Tavern the Capitol building of the United States for a few months in 1784. I think it was the ninth Capitol building of the United States. Just like Nassau Hall in Princeton had been a Capitol building of the United States in 1783. While meeting at the French Arms, the Continental Congress, of course, did business, but it also hosted the Marquis de Lafayette before he returned to France. So, still exploring Jacob Bergen, in 1795, he returned home to the historic West Windsor village of Dutch Neck, centered around the intersection of South Mill Road and Village Roads East and West. That year, 1795, he purchased an inn at the crossroads. 2 years later, on April 8th, 1797, just 2 months after Old Windsor Township split into East Windsor and West Windsor, Jacob Bergen hosted West Windsor Township's very first meeting in this very building, which you see pictured here. It's the green building. There, our first town government was elected, and it would often meet at this very inn for the next 80 years. Thus, this inn was effectively West Windsor's very first town hall, and it still stands at 212 to 214 South Mill Road. Now, we've explored a lot about the kind of the patriots of West Windsor. Again, I pointed out Jacob Bergen, Richard Stockton. But on the flip side of the coin, I want to explore a man named Thomas Hooper, who himself, unfortunately, did not have a happy story. Now, Thomas Hooper and his family lived in Windsor Township for much of the mid-1700s. In 1764, he opened an inn in the historic West Windsor community of Edinburgh, which itself is centered around the intersection of Old Trenton Road Edinburgh, and Windsor roads, which you can see in the map here. This was a popular town meeting spot, and Hooper maintained this inn until at least the start of the Revolutionary War. However, Hooper was reputedly also a British sympathizer. This angered many of his neighbors, and kind of seeing the writing on the wall, he went to Canada to scout out a potential new home for his family. However, while he was gone, several furious neighbors ransacked his house looking for him. I think there were some accounts of them bayoneting his beds and his closets, trying to stab at anything that they could, destroying his furniture. And obviously, most horrifying of all, they captured his wife, who was still recovering from childbirth, probably sexually assaulted her, and left her to die in an outhouse, which she did. So around 1784, Hooper, his children, and about a dozen other families fled to Prince Edward Island in Canada. Hooper died in 1816, hundreds of miles from his hometown, to which he probably never returned. So, next slide. So, as I'd mentioned a few times, Windsor Township split into East Windsor and West Windsor in 1797. And before then, these towns, East Windsor and West Windsor, as long as a bunch of other towns, including Robbinsville, and Princeton and a few others, didn't exist as independent townships. So upon that split in 1797, there still were only two towns, East Windsor and West Windsor. And this map here shows what West Windsor used to extend to, meaning the full extent of all of the green, all three shades of green. West Windsor retained all land in Princeton southeast of Nassau Street until the mid-1800s. It was not until 1838 that Princeton became an independent township and carved out about 0.7 square miles from West Windsor, including Nassau Hall. In 1853, a second land annexation, including the Princeton battlefield, pushed the West Windsor-Princeton border to the Delaware and Raritan Canal, where it remains to this day. I know there's a lot of people who think that the border is about Route 1 or Northeast Corridor, but it's not. It's the Delaware and Raritan Canal. So we're going to jump forward to the present day. So 2 years from now, the nation turns 250 years old. And there are a number of statewide initiatives to commemorate this anniversary, including something called Revolution NJ. There's the America 250 Central Bucks Consortium, and the Historical Society is applying to become involved in both of those organizations and possibly a few others. And we've had discussions, and there's nothing concrete yet, but we've had discussions about establishing a township-wide committee to celebrate the 250th birthday. And we'll probably give an update on that later this year. More immediate, however, and I think I heard that Helen Rankin is there. So hi, Helen. Is that the Historical Society is also beginning to work with the Princeton chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, of which Helen is a member, on installing markers at local graves of some Revolutionary War heroes. Now, this project is still in its infancy, so no updates yet, but stay tuned. So that is it for the presentation. Again, this is a 25-minute presentation. It could be a much more detailed but for the purpose of keeping the meeting short, it's a 25 minutes. I want to emphasize that if anyone's interested in learning more about local history, we do have a township history book for sale. I think there's a few copies at the farmstead. So you can buy it there, you can buy it online. We also have website and social media pages. And with that being said, I'm happy to take any questions. Or if no one has any questions, we can move on to the open discussion.
I have a question. Go ahead. So we, growing up, we're always led to believe that Washington crossed the Delaware and went right into Princeton. So I guess that's not on that evening. I guess that's not the case then.
No, so Washington crossed the Delaware into, I don't know how directly into Trenton he crossed into it, but the crossing the Delaware on December 26th was for the Battle of Trenton.
Okay, all right.
I have a question, Paul. The one point you mentioned about the Hessian troops taking the slayback cows, that property that is currently situated on Village Road West, is that where the alleged theft occurred, or was that house relocated to where it is now on Village Road West?
So the house was relocated, but it was relocated within its property boundaries. That property used to include I don't know if it's all of, but a substantial portion of the Lily Park 2 development, or it might be the original Lily Park development. It used to be at about 100 acres between Penlaw Road to the west, Southmoor Road to the east, and Village Road to the Village Road West to the south. And the farm used to be located a lot more central in that property, but a lot of it was sold to developers. They made the park developments, and the house was saved by moving it a lot closer to the road. But we're relatively certain that the actual capture of the cows took place within that property because David Slayback, as far as we've searched, owned no other substantial land holdings within West Windsor or within Windsor in general.
Okay, thank you. And then another real quick small question. I've heard that when Washington concluded the Battle of Princeton, they were going to make their way north to New Brunswick, but then were deterred or stopped. Do you know anything about that relationship to the Battle of Princeton?
Unfortunately, no. So I'm not necessarily a revolutionary expert. I'm a West Windsor a historian, and that's kind of where it begins and ends for me.
Oh,
Okay, thank you.
Paul and Andrew, we have our Somerset friends have something to say about that.
Yeah,
This thing?
the story is that Cornwallis had his treasury in Brunswick. And Washington wanted to go straight to Brunswick, not only to capture the treasury, but also because the British were exhausted. Problem was, so were the Patriots. So there was a horseback meeting in Rocky Hill at a cemetery, and his officers persuaded him not to go to New Brunswick. So they decided to go north to Morristown to camp for the winter.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the comments. Thank you.
And then they came north and went over the bridge that belonged to the Van Vechten family.
Plantation.
Yes, and the Van Vechten house is our headquarters.
Oh,
There you go.
someone else had a question. Andrew, did you have another question?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Okay.
So that was prior to winter or when was right after? Right after the Battle of Princeton. It was after.
Yeah, they went there and they stayed overnight, but they stayed for.
So they
Yeah.
came up what you would now know as Route 206 and along the Millstone River. And Millstone, the town now has a couple of houses where Washington stayed and the troops stayed, et cetera, before they moved on. So they camped in the Millstone area overnight.
And from there, they went to Morristown.
Then they went to Pluckerman, stayed in Pluckerman a couple of days, and then they went.
Yeah, but when they went to Marshtown, they stayed there and they got tired because, there was nothing to eat and stuff like that. So they stayed there, waiting to do the work.
Yeah, New Jersey had some of the most, if I don't know if it's the most, but it might be battles out of all the states and all the colonies in the Revolution. I know I think the term crossroads.
We have a bunch of people shaking their heads. How long is Karen?
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Okay.
Okay. Perfect. In that case, then we just come to the final portion of the lecture, which is the
Nice job.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you.
We clapped if you didn't hear it.
I didn't hear it. I think it was since it was all at once, it muted. Yeah, that's kind of how the sound system works.
Okay.
But we're getting on to the last portion of the lecture then, which is just open discussion. If anyone has anything they want to present, anything they want to talk about, any general questions, this is the time to do so.
Oh, yep, you were the first here. Oh, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of our former presenters on the Underground Railroad. He's doing it in Robbinsville tomorrow. Saturday, sorry about that.
Robbinsville Library.
Robin, okay.
Titled Slavery in the Underground Railroad in New Jersey. And I have 31 sides of all the genuine safe houses, not the ones that people claim to.
Claim to have. Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yep.
This is.
Paul, this is Paul.
I'm sorry. Paul, I'm from Cranberry.
Mhm.
And we're doing a lot of research on our American Revolution. And one of the names that came up was Riscaric Moore. Is that a name you're familiar with?
Yes, it's, I don't know in what context. I'll need to go back and look at my sources, but that is something that I definitely have seen the name before.
I noticed his name was not on your list, but he was a buddy of one of our soldiers from Cranberry. And I think he was in the 2nd Regiment that was based in Cranberry. And he lived like adjacent to the farmland of one of ours, James Bodine. And I did some of the translations of the pension applications, and Riscaric Moore verified that our James Bodine indeed served as what he did, which you always had to prove your years of service, right, to be eligible for a pension. And I believe he owned the old house that was here on Princeton Heights Town Road, that big white old house. I think it's been demolished the past few years. And I think that was the property of Riscaric Moore. And that's West Windsor, right?
It says where on?
It's that house, it's before McCaffrey's shopping center, that big empty lot.
Oh, then that would have been West Windsor.
Yeah.
Not the one that sat back.
Yes. that
Oh, with the
big
pillars?
old- Yes.
Wasn't, that could be
the-
East Windsor though, because there's a fine line between East
Over
Windsor and
there.
West Windsor there.
Yeah.
How far past?
I thought it was West Windsor.
Is it before the golf,
It's before the
before the golf?
cosmetic company. I think it's after the golf course, so I think it might be East
It's
Windsor.
after the cosmetic, before you turn left to go to the golf course. On Princeton Heights Town. Anyway, I'd be interested if you find out any information about Riscaric.
Okay, sure.
And he's one of the Riscarics, George Riscaric from Cranberry, who started our first inn. And the more I do research, the more I understand the boundaries were blurred, okay? And so when you're learning about one town, you're also learning about another town. So that was a comment, general comment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Did you give your email address on the sign-in form?
No, it didn't.
Okay, okay, yeah.
Any other questions?
The Edinburgh Inn story was very upsetting.
Yeah.
You live right there.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Not that you had anything to do with it.
No.
Decades.
Water is brutal, no matter the century, the locale.
Yeah. There's also where Mercer County Park comes out to Quaker Bridge Road at the corner of is it Hughes Drive and Quaker Bridge. I hike back there all the time and I came across a large stone that said George Washington stood here. And so I don't know if that was all part of that. And I was like, oh, George Washington stood in West Windsor Township, but it turns out that that's actually Lawrenceville, Hamilton Township. I thought it was in West Windsor.
Well, it might have been in West, or Windsor Township, as Paul said, that big conglomerate.
But I think it's right by the Assabunk. Is that the Assabunk? Assabunk River there?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I know which obelisk you're talking, but I think I know the one where Hughes Drive intersects Quaker Bridge. That one technically, I don't think it ever was in West Windsor or in Windsor. It's just on the other side of the border. That being said, again, that's one of the 12 obelisks that were installed in 1914. So there is one that is partly in West Windsor, and that's near Nassau Park Pavilion.
By Panera. That's how, yeah, Paul told us by Panera.
So you found all of them?
I haven't been to all of them, but it's generally, there are sources that show where all of them are.
Yeah.
There's an idea for a walk, Paul, if it's walkable. An interesting walking tour of the 12
So we're Perry Street and Trenton.
So that,
Years ago, we had field trips to Trenton, third grade, to walk the Revolutionary Path years ago, like 25 years ago. You might have, yeah, but we did do that. And we went into the Trenton State Museum, and the kids were amazed that there was a battle right there. Really captured their imaginations.
Any other questions?
They should do a movie on Mercer. Where he dies under the oak tree. Yeah. Oh, you could start that. Why don't you write that? Right to Hollywood. You got your outline.
Fair time.
We need them for our work. Forget Hollywood. That'll have to be a later career. Oscar winner.
I think we're done, Paul, at this end.
Where it's a wrap.
perfect. Great, thank you.
I think we got it.
Okay, great. So again,